I appreciate y'all coming out. Curt and I decided to dress alike. Y'all didn't realize and see the resemblance here. So
I called him. What are you wearing?
that's how we show our vulnerability. So you got some good questions here. So hopefully you'll be ready for them. So I like within this first one, there's a question here of define the soul. What is the difference between mind and soul?
I have no idea. I mean, I don't know. I think I'm Mike. Yeah, recently they're in fact coming up somewhere this fall. There are researchers at Harvard that think that they've got some, that think that they have some data on this, that they think that they can define what the soul is from a neurobiological perspective. Now, I've read their abstracts, I've read what they're thinking about, and I'm like, it's interesting stuff. I don't know where the mind and the soul start and stop and so forth and so on. I mean, there's lots of work, and I'm sure that folks here can speak to this more effectively in terms of like what the Hebrews would have written about this and what the Greeks would have written about this and so forth and so on. But I would say this: regardless of what we call it. And there's a lot of energy being spent on identifying whether or not we are a soul or we have a soul. And if you look at two different, I can name two different very prominent evangelical seminaries whose philosophy departments have very different ideas about this. And all I would say is that regardless of whether I have a soul or am a soul or where the soul stops and the mind starts, it doesn't keep me from still having to do the work that we've talked about today. At the end of the day, I don't know that I'm ever going to know where those lines are, but I do know what I do know. I do know that I think, image, feel, think, and behave. I do know that those things probably affect the general sense of myself at my core, and if that's my soul, so be it. I do have the sense as a believer that God's doing his work, as he tells Jeremiah, and Jeremiah has to do his work, right? And of course, we worry, right? I worry that I don't know where my work ends and God's work begins, or where my work ends and the patient work. How many of you have patients that you think you're working harder than the patient is? Right? So we always have, this is the rule, you never work harder than your patient, you never work harder than your parishioner, you never do this, because the minute you're doing their work, somebody's work isn't getting done. All that to say is that for me, and I've had this question, for me, I think that question often underlies my desire to know exactly where the lines are in order to make sure that I know which lines I cross and don't cross, so that I don't make mistakes, don't screw it up, and God won't be pissed at me. I think that's how I'll leave that. Yeah. That's good.
So here's another, just kind of going from the abstract to the practical here. So we have kind of a compilation of different professionals here, being healthcare providers, mental health providers, support staff within those sectors, ministers, and educators. What are some just helpful tips for applying these for just some of those various professions? You may speak to some of those specifically, but then maybe two just general concepts of just application of some of these themes to doing this work and helping others.
Right. So I think that it's like a lot of things. We have varying, vocational places that we're working that you've just described. Most of the time, all of those vocational, they're going to require different levels of what I would call different levels of mechanics, and I don't mean that in some cold way. I mean, if I'm a surgeon, I'm going to have a certain level, I'm going to be doing certain things mechanically in a way, like when the patient's under anesthesia, that if I'm a psychiatrist, I'm not doing that. If I'm changing tires, I'm doing something different. If I'm teaching in a classroom, I'm doing something different, if that makes sense. We all have different levels of how much we're doing mechanically with things. But there are two things that I would say that are common to all that, and one is my ability to be attuned to whoever it is that I'm working with at any given time. If I'm changing a tire, I know that I'm going to be attuned to the owner of that car. I'm going to want to have to be able to be attuned to that person and to be aware that my interactions with them are going to be dependent upon not just what they bring to the table, but what I'm bringing to the table at any given moment. So I'm going to have to be doing my work all the time to the degree that I'm going to be attuned to people in any given area of this. And so I want to be attuned to myself, and that's where we get back to, like, I can't do that very well if I'm not doing the work myself on these things that we've talked about. So attunement is one. That's the first thing. Here's another thing. Being curious is a second thing. And when you think about practical things, like, think about the number of times when you have an interaction with a patient of whatever, and whatever field you're in. And the first thing I want to do when the patient tells me something is I want to correct the patient. I want to inform the patient. I want to tell the patient what to do. Now, there are times when that's appropriate to do, but I would suggest that being committed to being curious is a step that comes before that enables us to ask them the question, I'm wondering about fill in the blank. I'm curious about fill in the blank, whatever this is. People are talking to you about, like, why they can't do what they're supposed to do to, take care of their hypertension. And of course, we're all going to try to be, like, good soldiers in this and do our work and be like, well, why aren't you doing this? Why aren't you doing that? But at some point, we want to tell them what to do. Amen? Because don't we all want to just tell people what to do? Right. And so I would think that our own awareness is number one. Number two, curiosity. Number three, I would say I long for people being willing to be committed to living themselves more rhythmically. By rhythmically, I mean starting things with like, how many of us are, like, feeling like we're just being driven day after day after day, like, with the pressure of the work that we have to do. For people of faith, we would say, like, well, what do you actually conduct a Sabbath? Do you actually conduct, and for anybody else, do you actually conduct 2 or 3 times in the course of the day where you're going to take 2 to 3 minutes and you're going to pause and you're going to do some meditation work that's going to allow you to become more attuned to where you are in order for you to become more attuned to where the other is? All that's wrapped up in the question of, am I myself living a more rhythmic life? So those are 3 things: being mindful, right, about being curious, and then being rhythmic.
What about here, just touching on the effect of, you kind of mentioned things like centering prayer and mindfulness and things of that nature, but touch on the effect of spiritual disciplines on neurobiology as well as neuroaffect.
Well, I think if you've read Richard Foster's book, he's pretty quick to point out that spiritual disciplines are not something that are intended in and of themselves, right? Their purpose is not just to do them for the sake of doing them. If I'm fasting once a week, the fact that I'm fasting once a week in and of itself is not the point. The point is, if I'm fasting once a week, what am I doing during that time? If I'm using centering prayer, if I'm any of these kinds of things that I'm doing, I think for me, one of the main things the thread that runs throughout spiritual disciplines is that it really does, it asks me and requires the focus of my attention to remain in one place for a long period of time. So if I'm going to fast, you know how it is. Like, I ate breakfast this morning, and I had a nice breakfast. But as soon as I ate breakfast, I didn't think about lunch or dinner at all. But if I'm on a fast day, as soon as I'm done with breakfast, all I can think about is the fact that I'm not eating for 24 hours, right? You see, my mind, like, how easy it is for my mind to just, like, race. And it reveals how untethered I am. And so a lot of what the practice of spiritual disciplines does is that it gives us opportunities for us over time to actually, strengthen our capacity to pay attention. It's one of the first things that it does. It also helps us practice restraint. That's the second thing that it does. It helps me practice restraint, which is something that I typically only do when I know that the police officer is waiting around the turn. That's when I practice restraint. I wouldn't normally do it. We have this one place in Arlington where everybody slows down under 40 because we know that if you don't, you're busted. But, like, otherwise, like, we just go through it, right? I want to practice restraint, because restraint then enables me to pause long enough for me to be much more aware of what I'm sensing, imaging, feeling, thinking, and behaving, so that I can make those choices behaviorally on purpose, as opposed to those choices are things I'm just living out as an automaton, which often end up with me doing things like I did with my son, in that conversation where I, shamed him to death. So I think those are the main things that spiritual disciplines do. And I think the fact that we have a variety of them actually access different domains of our minds, different domains of integration, so it gives different domains opportunity to be exercised.
Yeah. What are some, just like even for your own personal journey of spiritual formation, like speak a little bit, or with maybe just kind of working with a patient, speak about maybe a few particular ways of various spiritual disciplines and how that's both led to maybe reduction in symptoms, but then also just kind of increased awareness of some of that. Yeah.
So I think that one of the things that I have a good friend, best man at our wedding, Jeff Dudiak. He's a philosophy professor at the King's University in Edmonton, Alberta. And one of the things that Jeff likes to talk about is the difference between the word true and how we often in our world we use it as we like to talk about it as a noun, right? The word truth. We're looking for truth, this thing, this abstract thing. And Jeff likes to talk about it as an adverb. And he says, what does it mean not just to find truth, but what does it mean for us to live truly? What does it mean for us to live truly? And he's not diminishing the use of the word truth, but he's inviting people to truly. And one of the things that we say that we do, and one of the things that we think that spiritual disciplines do, is that we believe that it enables people to tell their story more truly. When you do trauma work, right? Trauma work is when people are traumatized and disintegrated, they're not able to tell their story very truly because they can't bring these pieces together. It's only when a clinician does that kind of work with them that they're actually able to tell their story more truly, if that makes sense. So everything that we're doing from a spiritual discipline standpoint, I would suggest, is enabling that process. So for patients, when let's say, for instance, if they're going to do confession, one of the things that we talk about, I've had a spiritual director for 27 years. Once this Anglican priest in Northern Virginia that I met with, and the main thing that happens is not just that I tell him things. I don't just confess my sins and my sin. It is in the telling that I witness his voice, that I witness him being present with me in those moments of greatest brokenness. And so we find that people are actually able to tell their story more truly, which is that my story is not, like Steve, my story is not just one of brokenness. My story is one in which my brokenness is actually being redeemed. But that's not just an abstract fact. That's happening as a result of what's actually happening with me and my director, or with me and a patient in the room. When we fast, for instance, we become much more attuned to what my hungers are, to what my longings are, to the things that I really want. And of course, it's easy for us to think, I'm just impulsive, or I'm just this, or I'm just that. No, I'm not just that I'm impulsive, it's that I have really deep longings that I heretofore never access, never talk about, never tell you, but I will guarantee you in some way, shape, or form I'm acting them out. But to fast means I get to tell that story more truly and then make different choices about what I'm going to do with those longings.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. So I think it's about 3, so I'm thinking one more question here. Just, you talked about this kind of benefit of group and how that just allows this potential for healing in a way that's just different from these kind of individual relationships with a provider. Speak a little bit about the specific role of maybe the church and being this kind of healing community, of how that happens, and maybe even a more particular way than just your standard kind of clinical groups.
Right. So we were talking about this at dinner last night. Many places we've talked about how do we export what we're doing in the clinical setting? How do we export that, and how do we help churches do that kind of thing? First of all, I would say this kind of work is really hard to do. It's not easy, and and part of why it is because we already enter into this kind of work without a great deal of practice trusting others with our tender places. We don't have a lot of practice with that. Part of why it probably works in clinical settings is because at some level the patients who are entering into it are being asked by therapists that they already have a relationship with, and they don't know the other people in the group outside of that group, and you've got two therapists that are helping to kind of create a confidentiality ring that most people are willing to play by the rules and so forth. So I would say though that what I tell people in these groups that we do, if I had 2 worship songs at the beginning, and I had a 5-minute homily reflection in the middle, and we had the Eucharist at the end, we'd have church 4 times a week in our practice. Because this is really what's happening in this space is that we really do believe that we're coming together at this intersection of interpersonal neurobiology and Christian spiritual formation for people to tell their stories more truly. And as they do, everything about their marriages and their work and their parenting and blah, 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 that's outside that space is being transformed. Well, how can we create, I don't know, in a church we would say, okay, we'll start with 3 people. Like, who are going to be the 3 people who are willing to take the risk of, and beginning with the pastors, beginning with the elders, beginning with the deacons, who are going to be people who are going to be willing to take the risk of entering into this and taking the risk of telling your whole story truly? Like, can you imagine? Like, that's a scary thing to do. Like, in Northern Virginia, like, we know, like, I see pastors, and pastors know that, like, it's not an easy thing to, like, put your life out with other people because of what might happen, because, like, it is not an easy thing. But what would happen if we would just take 2 or 3 and start? If you take 3 or 5 and start? My sense is that if people are willing, even in small ways, to begin to practice telling their stories, we've got some models that we've talked about in the backs of both of the books that I've written, in which people can do this. These kind of confessional times together are places to begin, where we can, begin to recognize that, like, telling the truth, telling my story more truly is more than just going to a Bible study and then telling people what you can pray for between now and the next time that we meet next week. I do think you start with small numbers. You start with people, and by small numbers, I mean like 3 or 4 people. You start with people who are willing to take the risk, and you say, like, we're going to try this for 6 weeks. And if it's 6 weeks, nobody's killed each other, you can then try it for like 6 more weeks. And if you've done it for 12 weeks, then you say, let's see if we can find 1 or 2 other people who will join the group, who will tell their stories more truly. And it does require people who are pretty self-regulated. It does require people who are, I think, spiritually mature to do that, and people who can, practice restraint, among other things. And I feel like I'm not being very helpful with answering this question, because I think the question's not easy to answer. I haven't found it to be easy to answer. Yeah.
Well, I appreciate you coming in, and all of y'all to come as well. Just this amount of people vested in these kinds of things is really encouraging for me. People coming from different areas of interest, just with that commonality of helping people and applying some of these things to do that. So I really appreciate that.
In our promotional material, we actually said we would go to 3:30. So if you want to ask a few
some more questions, okay.
Maybe 3:15 or something.
Yeah. If anyone has, I have some more questions here, but if anyone does have anything that's kind of striking them, feel free to come up front and I can hand you the mic. It's not wireless, so I can't come too far, so you're going to have to be brave and come down, but I have a few other questions here. I thought this was interesting. They have, as you know, with Siegel, with interpersonal neurobiology, he also has these more kind of macro ideas in mind about how that affects policy and kind of these broader level things. And so there's a question here. In talking about shame being intergenerational, as well as kind of macro context, how do you think shame keeps racism stuck in the social structure of America?
I think I would have bought an island somewhere in the Caribbean if I knew the answer to that question, because I think I would have made enough money in the answer to you know what I mean. So my sense is So we were talking a little about this at the break. My experience and my sense of this is that this really is a phenomenon that we address, and this might sound, well, I think we address it one relationship at a time. And I don't mean to sound overly simplistic, but I mean one relationship, and that relationship then needs to, though, with intention, grow. And by grow, I mean, like, I think that, I remember when I was in medical school and then residency, and I remember that African-American males, historically across the board, always had greater hypertension problems than other folks. And I trained in North Philadelphia, right? And we had, in the population, and it always struck me, and I wonder how much of that has to do with race. How much? I don't mean because they're black. I mean because of racism. Like how much hypertension is being, because collectively there is this thing that's happening that nobody's accounting for. And I would say that to the degree, one thing I would say is that first of all is that shame. It's easy for us to talk about shame as an abstraction. It's easier to talk about like is this kind of like academic idea. When, as we talked about earlier today, shame, as far as what the neurobiology tells, like it is a neuroaffective thing. Like it happens to real human beings in real bodies, and the way that it is healed is when we human beings are interacting with other human beings who, when our shame is being sensed, we're going to name that, and we're not going to leave the room until it's taken care of. We're going to name that, and we're going to say, this is what this is coming from, and I need to be able to address that. And so, I mean, I don't think it takes rocket science to see how much shame plays a role in racism. I mean, I just think that that's pretty patently self-evident to me. It seems like, and it's ubiquitous. I mean, I'm aware. Like I'm a 56-year-old white guy, and so that means that kind of almost by definition, I probably have more power in this room than anybody. Right? I recognize that. And so then the question becomes, what do I do with that? And what do I do when I'm with other people who are different than me? And race is one place in which that happens. And another place where it happens, it has to do with men and women, right? As we say, like there's no war that's been fought longer and harder than the war between men and women over the course. I mean, and so this has long and deep roots. And again, I think that when Dan talks about it, like I think it's possible to talk about it in those terms. I think what's made more difficult is, are we able and willing to then do the work of being in community with people who are different than we are in order for that shame to be tackled and to do it in the ways that we've talked about. Yeah.
How about, how would you encourage someone, so if someone like is seeing you in a context like clinical context, or it's just a friend that you have that you're trying to help out, who's having a really hard time with having relationships and wants that, how would you encourage someone to seek those deep relationships in order to heal from past shame? And how might you like go about trying to set that up in a way that's going to be fruitful for them rather than just leading to more shame or more hurt? How do you kind of handle that when someone's just been through a lot of trauma or shame? Yeah.
So one of the questions that is often given to me is like, so if I've been someplace to speak, people will say, okay, so how can we set this up here in our community? How can we just start to do this, these communities? How can we just gather people together? And I said, you know what? I said it's hard to do because if you were in Northern Virginia and you were in our practice, we would say, well, we want you to be part of our group. That's what we would do. But a lot of people don't have access to that. A lot of people don't have, it's not easy, we'll just go to a group. We don't have, the opportunity to do that. And it reminds me of, Paul Borger wrote a book called Genesis, the Story We Haven't Heard. Borger is a professor of literature at Gordon College. He writes this, every year he teaches a course on Genesis as a literature course, not as a religion course, as a literature course. And out of it came this book, Genesis, the Story We Haven't Heard. And in the book, he talks about how God calls Abraham to go to Palestine. And Borger points out, he said, who knows how many people God tried to get to cooperate with him to go to Palestine before he finally happened upon Abraham, who agreed to go? We don't know because there's no story told there. And then you think about Jesus. The number of, we read the gospel text and he's sort of like Peter, James, John, Andrew, they just, you want to come, you want to come, you want to come. Like, yeah, who knows how many people Jesus asked to be his disciple who said no? We know that there are some who said no after the fact. Asking people to do these kinds of hard things is like we might be met with hard things. And so it means, who are the people that, can you name two people? Can you name two people with whom you're willing to tell your story? Right? And we can construct ways to do that. We say, I'm going to give you 20 minutes to tell your story. And then we're going to give you some questions to ask, and some reflections to have. There's some structure that we can give to that. But I can say that for people who want to do this, but who've had trauma, it's going to require extra trustworthy relationships to get that process started. The hardest thing that I would say for me is how do we help encourage people to just get started at doing this with 2 or 3 or 4 relationships to begin with, which is not easy to do.
Right.
Yeah.
So you talk about, and you've talked about some here, just kind of emotions being kind of that fuel that gets us going. And so even things like anger or some of these other emotions aren't kind of bad in and of themselves. It's just kind of how you understand it and what you do with it. So that's just setting up the context for this next question, which is shame a bad emotion, or shame, how they frame it, is it even the issue, or I guess an issue? How would you respond to that?
Yeah. And I think we talked a little bit about this in the group, in the breakout. I don't know if this is helpful or not. In the 7th chapter of 2 Corinthians, Paul says this. He says, there is a godly grief that leads to repentance, and there is an ungodly grief that leads to death. And he doesn't use the word shame he uses the word shame in other places where that's where he intends to use it. But it makes me wonder, I think of this and I think, I think that I think shame is an affect that we experience. The problem is not shame itself, the problem is what we do in response to it. That what it does, it acts as a signal. And it acts as a signal of impending abandonment. It acts as a signal of impending disintegration. And it also acts as a signal not just to the one who's experiencing it, but I would also suggest that to those of us, if we're paying attention, we will notice when shame is showing up in others around us, and it is our job to go find them. It is our job to do the work of pursuit. And so, Paul's language, I would say that, there is a godly grief. There is a way in which I feel shame about things that shame is a proper response. And the question then is going to be, what do I do in response to that? And what I do in response to that will largely be in connection with how connected am I to a community that won't let me alone with that. I think about the difference between what Peter did and what Judas did to essentially similar kinds of things. I mean, they both betrayed him, right? But Peter had a different encounter. Now, interestingly enough, for whatever reason, Peter, James, and John were pretty intent upon being in this close connection with Jesus. We don't hear much about Judas in that regard. And I wonder about that. I wonder, was Peter's connection also about why was it that Peter didn't go out and hang himself? Why was it that happened? And those two different stories. And I want to suggest that it's not just about the shame that the one person experiences, but it also has a lot to do with their tethered experience relationally to others that's going to mitigate that. And so a godly response to this kind of grief is repentance, right? Shame gets my attention about something that I need to get turned around about. And there is an ungodly grief, there is an isolated response to it. There is a response to shame that I experience in the privacy of my own mind and when I'm not in community that just leads me further and further down the rabbit hole in which death literally becomes the end of the line for me. And so, that's what that's what I have to say.
All right. Still open for other people, but I have a few more here, so feel free to come up.
And you might not even have to come up. You can just raise your hand, and then we can repeat the question.
Yeah. There we go.
Okay, so you said that when you're starting these groups that you need to have people that are able to regulate themselves, and then you said spiritually mature. Did you say that they need to be spiritually mature, or is it not necessary?
Well, I mean, I think when we do these groups in our practice, there are a couple of, I mean, one requirement is that each member needs to be able to emotionally self-regulate. And what do we mean by that? We mean that, like, you can be angry with me, but you can't throw the lamp at me. You can want to drink, but we can't, like, we need to know that you're not going to be actively drinking if you have an alcohol problem. We need to know that you're not going to be dissociating. We need to know, there are a number of things that, in the context of this group. And once that's the case, we're also going to need to know that there's somebody in the group who's probably going to be able to see it as their role to kind of be responsible for what's happening in the process of the group. It's one thing for members to come to the group and tell their story, but as we all know, part of what we're having to learn to do is not just to tell my story, I'm also having to learn to tell the story that the group is telling at any given time, right? Because the group itself is going to develop a story. Does that make sense? Yeah? Like, so there's going to be a certain felt tenor in the room, and somebody's going to have to be able to pause and say, I wonder what other people are feeling. Somebody's going to have to be able to pause and say, gosh, I wonder what everybody else is noticing here about what we're not saying, and so forth and so on. And so when I say spiritually mature, I mean, I think what I'm talking about are people who are thoughtful and people who are aware that so much of what our spiritual life ends up being, like we end up articulating a lot of things about our developmental life in spiritual language, which for many people is unhelpful. Because it all then becomes a God problem rather than where the problem really is, which is with my dad or my mom or my sibling or whatever. And so it's going to be important for people to be able to help people language things in a way that actually identifies where their longings and their griefs actually lie, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Do you do any kind of training for leadership groups?
You mean for these groups? Yeah, in our practice.
So in those settings, it's kind of like a clinician, licensed therapist, or something.
Right.
To that nature.
Right. So we have two kinds of groups that we run. We have same gender groups, right? So there's a men's group that I run, and there's a women's group that a couple of other therapists run, and then there's a co-ed. There are 3 co-ed groups that my clinical director and I run, which is a different kind of journey. All right. So we're like men and women in the same room. Like everybody's eyebrows are raising, right? Right. And but men and women are in the same room here, so okay, it works. And in the men's groups that we've run, and in some of the women's groups that we've run, those groups are time limited. They run about 8 to 9 months, weekly, 90 minutes. And part of the task from the very beginning that we let them know is that we're really, we're not just giving them an experience, we're also giving them an experience in which we want them to take this, and when they leave, they can continue to do this. But it's not something that they could do by just like doing it for 6 weeks, because I have men who it takes like 7 of the 9 months before they become convinced that they need to be here, right? But by the time that they're ready to be done, these are some of the people who are most likely to want this group to continue. So there's those kinds of groups, but then the ongoing process groups are the ones that they're just ongoing, and so they're not time limited. So those folks are going to be in those groups, for as long as they want to be in them. So the training that takes place for the patients that are in them, in those, we do that as part of the curriculum. Now, not all of those groups, continue to meet when they're done. Yeah. Well, we've only had 2 or 3 of them that have done that over the last 12 years. Even though we make it plain to them that that's what we want them to do.
So if you've been trained or can facilitate in groups, counseling groups, do you have like any kind of curriculum or anything that would help in starting, guiding?
Like if someone might want to do that in Alabama, for me? Yeah. Yeah, we're actually working on I've got a colleague who's taken this work that we've done, and they are close to having that curriculum completed. Yeah, right. So we can talk. Yeah.
I have a question here, kind of referencing,
Did you have a question?
Raising his hand.
Yeah, I'm curious to know how you would use, Romans 5.
Yeah.
Use that in the context of helping people understand what it means when it says therefore now no condemnation.
So, like, there is therefore now no condemnation in Christ for those who are in Christ Jesus. Right? So, it's a great question. I've often told people that, like, you know, that first sentence in the 8th chapter of Romans is like, I don't know that there is a more helpful sentence in all of Paul's writings. The challenge is like, well, how do I actually appropriate that? How do I actually live into that? And this is where I want to emphasize that, you know, one of the things that trauma work has done over the last 15 to 20 years is that it has brought us, like, it has made it very clear that the notion of trying to treat people psychotherapeutically primarily from the left side of the brain is just not very effective. It's not helpful. Because I got to get the body involved, and I've got to get the right hemisphere involved. And I would suggest the same thing is true here. For someone just to tell me there is therefore now no condemnation, like, I don't really know what that feels like. You know, here's another one. Like in the 3rd chapter of Colossians, for you have died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. I love that. I have no idea what that means. Right? Now, and what I mean by that, like, I don't mean I don't know what that means theologically. I mean, where in my body am I supposed to feel that? How is that going to make a difference for me at 3 o'clock in the afternoon when the patient who's coming in is one that I hoped had canceled? Right? Because we all have them, right? Our 3 o'clocks. They've canceled. Yes! Right? Right? So this is where come on, we're just going to be like, we're telling our story more truly here, okay? So this is the thing, like, this is where I would say, so I've met, like I mentioned, like, I've got this spiritual director that I've met with, and I've got these 2 other men that I've met with every Tuesday morning for the last 27 years for confession and prayer. And I want to say that when I have to imagine what it means for there therefore to be no condemnation, I imagine being in the room with Jerry and Byron. That's what I have to imagine. I have to imagine talking to my good friend Terry Wardle. I have to imagine his voice. I have to, like, it's not just an abstraction that's going to change my mind. It's going to be a fully practiced, embodied experience with this. And so, again, it gets back to this question of who are the people who are regularly in our lives, who are forming us into people of goodness and beauty, who are forming us into people who, when I leave the house in the morning. Okay, I'll say this. Like, so tomorrow morning, I have the privilege of preaching here tomorrow. And one of the things that we're going to talk about is this whole notion of what it means when Jesus says, "You're the light of the world." Usually when I hear that text, "You're the light of the world," who would put their light under a bushel, right? Who would light a lamp and put it under a bushel? So I read that text, and I think I hear him say, "Curt, you're the light of the world. Don't screw it up." Now, I don't know if anybody else here even comes close to thinking that or feeling that, but there's a certain pressure, right, to be the light of the world, because that's who you are. Like, so don't mess it up. But what if I were to hear it like this? What if I were to hear Jesus say, "You know, you are absolutely illuminating. You're just illuminating." And I'd be turning around and like, who are you talking to? Because most of us don't believe that we are illuminating. I don't mean that we don't assent to the notion and the theological idea. Like, do we walk out of our front door with the sense of like, oh my gosh, who's going to get to be lit up by me today? Most of us are not walking out of the front door with that in mind. I don't mean in some arrogant way, but some sense that like God is saying, I can't wait to introduce you to whoever you're going to see today, and their life will be never the same. But I have to have the practice of being in the place of, through prayer, through embodied experience, through engagement with beauty, or in which like I can actually live in a way that I believe that because I've had the physical experience of this is who I am. That there is no condemnation because I'm living as if like I'm not condemnable. But that takes practice. And a lot of exposure to people who are reminding me that that's how we live our lives. Mike's coming for us.
Here it comes.
Yeah.
Thank you, Curt. Thanks for this afternoon. Thank you for our presenters, for Zach and Patrice. I know you guys want to show your appreciation to them. Curt did his own promo, but if you are a guest here today, just want to remind you that tomorrow at 8:30 and 11 o'clock in our sanctuary, Dr. Thompson will be preaching. Also at 10 o'clock right here in St. Andrews again, he's going to be talking about the soul of shame. So I want to encourage you to come back if you're a guest, and we are very thankful that you're here this afternoon and hope God has used this time and blessed your heart with it. Hope you have a great rest of the day and illuminate someone.